Chapter 24, Section 3, The Return of War, 1939 to 1941. As Winston Churchill predicted after the Munich Conference of 1938, appeasement only made Hitler bolder. However, Germany's takeover of Bohemia in March of 1939 finally caused Great Britain and France to draw a line in the sand. Hitler had been demanding the return of Danzig, an ethnically German city in the Polish corridor that lay on the Baltic Sea. The Polish corridor, a strip of land that cut through and divided Germany, had been created by the Treaty of Versailles to give Poland a seaport. Keep in mind, guys, that even though we do have planes at this time, trade primarily comes from sea-based, I guess, vessels, big ships and things like that. So those countries are still really striving for those seaports. Britain and France now warned Hitler that any aggression against Poland would result in war. So your first section, little subsection here, is Germany reduces the Soviet threat. Hitler already planned to attack Poland and risk a general war in Europe. Part of his planning for this war involved the Soviet Union. He intended to eventually conquer the Soviet Union, which had vast farmlands and other resources that could fulfill Germany's quest for Lebensraum, or living space. However, Hitler needed the Soviet Union to remain neutral if Britain and France went to war. The geography of such a war concerned him because the Soviet Union was to the east of him and Britain and France were to the west. He did not want to fight a war on two fronts like he had to, well, when he was a soldier in World War I. So Hitler was very well aware of that issue. So for that reason, in Hitler's mind, Soviet neutrality, or the Soviet Union remaining neutral, was very, very important. The Nazis and communists despised and distrusted each other. So the world was actually really shocked when Hitler and Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, who, keep in mind, guys, the dictator of a communist nation, so the fact that Hitler, the leader of the Nazis and the leader of the biggest communist nation in the world, the fact that they signed a non-aggression treaty in August of 1939 was really surprising to the rest of the world. The pact served the interests of both leaders. Hitler no longer had to worry about going to war with the Soviets before he was ready to. For Stalin, the pact satisfied his desire for more power and for secure borders. In return for Stalin's pledge not to attack Germany, Hitler secretly promised him a part of Poland and a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Okay, so you can go ahead and pause the video and do your one-sentence summary, and then go to that student handout and find a letter that corresponds with that section. The war begins. With the Soviet Union neutralized, Hitler quickly sprang into action. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler announced that Germany was annexing Danzig. As he spoke, German forces were invading Poland. 2 days later, France and Britain declared war on Germany. Hitler's attack on Poland introduced a new kind of warfare, the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It consisted of swift, massive, and highly coordinated attacks by waves of warplanes, tanks, and infantry. Communications by radio, a new technology that was perfected in the 1920s, so after World War I, before World War II, allowed such attacks to be coordinated and carried out. German warplanes launched attacks on railroads, airfields, communications networks, military bases, and other strategic sites. Meanwhile, infantry, supported by tanks and artillery, pushed toward key cities and other objectives. As German planes rained bombs and bullets on the enemy, motorized infantry units quickly swept toward them. Then the foot soldiers moved in to finish the job. So Hitler's got a pretty decent method going on here, honestly. Faced with such overwhelming force, the Polish army quickly collapsed. 2 weeks after the Blitzkrieg began, Soviet troops invaded from the east. So honestly, they're kind of at this point in the war, the Soviet Union is working with Germany to invade Poland, and by early October of 1939, all of Poland was under German or Soviet control. So Hitler shifts his focus to the west. He moves 2 million soldiers to Germany's border with France and the Low Countries, which would be Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. France relied for its main defense on the Maginot Line, which is a string of heavily armed fortresses along their border with Germany. If you guys pull up a map of France, or excuse me, of Europe, you'll see that France and Germany share a pretty significant border, and France was a little bit scared of Germany and Hitler, so they worked really hard to fortify or strengthen that border before all of this began. Most French troops massed here, while others gathered along the border that France shares with Belgium. British forces crossed the English Channel, prepared to aid France in the Low Countries. For the next few months, not much happened. Newspapers began referring to this as the phony war. Suddenly, in a series of lightning actions, Hitler struck. In April of 1940, German forces launched surprise attacks on Denmark and Norway. Within a few weeks, they had conquered these two Scandinavian countries. Then, on May 10th, the Germans invaded the Low Countries. Remember, that would be Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. So in 18 days, those three nations were in German hands. Using blitzkrieg tactics, a German army burst through Luxembourg and southern Belgium into France in just 4 days. Then it began a dramatic drive toward the French coast. Skirting the Maginot Line, the Germans sped westward. Hundreds of thousands of French and British troops found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket of French countryside. They retreated toward the port of Dunkirk on the northwest coast of France. Britain sent every boat it could find across the English Channel to evacuate soldiers. The daring rescue saved some 338,000 men. So Paris soon falls to the Germans. Mussolini, from Italy, takes this opportunity to declare war on Great Britain and France. On June 22nd, France surrenders to Germany. If you guys go to Google and look, there are pictures of Hitler standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. And that's kind of pretty significant because the Eiffel Tower is the symbol of France, and it kind of portrays how he conquered the city of love, I guess. So under the terms of the armistice, Germany occupied 3/5 of the country. A puppet government ruled the unoccupied region. It was called Vichy France for the town that was its capital. So you can go ahead and pause the video now and do your sentence summary as well as your letter in the student handout found on Google Classroom. The Battle of Britain. The fall of France left Great Britain to face Hitler alone. At this point, guys, the U.S. is not involved. They wanted to remain neutral. They remembered what World War I was like. The U.S. did not want to get involved in European affairs. And we'll read a little bit later about what it was that finally got the U.S. involved. But back to the focus of the Battle of Britain. Again, Great Britain is facing Hitler alone. Their new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, vowed to continue the fight. He said, "We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender." Hitler was determined to conquer Britain, which was the last holdout in Europe against Nazi rule. This all happened really fast. Yet he realized that Britain's navy could keep his army from crossing the English Channel. To counter that threat, Germany had to control the air with airplanes. Airplanes came in at the very end of World War I, so we haven't talked much about those yet. Hitler set up bases and conquered lands from France to Norway and moved some 2,500 bombers and fighter planes to them. From these bases, German planes flew thousands of air raids over Great Britain in the summer and fall of 1940. They bombed ports, airfields, radar stations, and industrial centers. Fighter planes of the Royal Air Force, which would be in Great Britain, countered this onslaught in what became known as the Battle of Britain. Go ahead and Google Battle of Britain and it'll show you guys the absolute destruction of major cities like London. Between July and October, the RAF had lost 915 aircraft. However, RAF pilots had downed more than 1,700 German aircraft. In September of 1940, Britain launched its first bombing raid on Berlin. After that, Hitler shifted his targets to British cities. Bombing attacks over the next several months ended up devastating parts of London and other large cities. Londoners called this period the Blitz, which was just simply a shortening of the word blitzkrieg. By spring of 1941, the number of raids dwindled. German industry simply could not replace the lost planes fast enough. The British had successfully defended their homeland, and their victory ended up raising hopes that Hitler could be stopped. So I'm going to show you guys this map here. I'll zoom in on it. This is the German territorial expansion from 1939 to 1940. So we're looking at 1 year. That first year and a half of the war, Germany was really successful. So the light green is going to be under Axis control. The Axis powers were Germany and Italy. And France starts out as an allied power with Great Britain, but they fall really quickly. So on this map, that light green that you see is going to be countries that were taken over by Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy. And then those yellow countries are going to be neutral. Make sure that you guys know those major ones for your test coming up next week. Know that your allied powers are going to be Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States. The U.S. comes in later. Your neutral nations, Spain, Switzerland, Sweden, and then your Axis powers are going to be Germany and Italy. So this map, I think, does a really good job of showing how fast Hitler got control of Europe. So that's the end of the Battle of Britain section. So if you want to pause the video and do your one-sentence summary and find your letter in the student handout, you can go ahead and do that. The United States prepares for war. When war broke out in Europe, isolationism lost some of its appeal for Americans. Most wanted to help the Allies, but they did not want the U.S. to get involved in fighting. Yet France and Britain needed weapons, and the Neutrality Acts that they had signed earlier on banned arms sales to belligerent nations. So in November of 1939, Congress conveniently passed another Neutrality Act that repealed the arms embargo. However, the new law included a cash and carry provision, which meant that the nations that were buying weapons from the United States had to pay in cash for those things, and then they had to use their own ships to carry those, whatever those materials might be. They had to use their own ships to carry those. After the fall of France, the U.S. finally began to prepare for war. You guys got to keep in mind that even though Britain once controlled the U.S. colonies, they were the one country that has always, them and France, have always been allies of the United States. So defense spending in the U.S. skyrockets, as does the size of the Army. In September of 1940, Congress enacts the first peacetime military draft in U.S. history. Yet during the 1940 election campaign, President Roosevelt assures Americans by saying, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." Still hoping to avoid war, Americans elected him to an unprecedented third term. That doesn't happen anymore. He's the only president to have served 4 terms. There's now an amendment to the Constitution that says you can only serve 2. In December of 1940, with the Battle of Britain still raging, Churchill declares that his country is nearly bankrupt. Roosevelt was determined to provide Britain all aid short of war. He urged Congress to adopt a plan to lend, not sell, arms to Britain. This legislation, the Lend-Lease Act, passed in March of 1941, but only after heated public and congressional debate. In June of 1941, Hitler broke his pact with Joseph Stalin by attacking the Soviet Union. I think we probably could have all seen that coming. The Soviet army retreated in the face of the invasion. With Churchill's support, the U.S. began sending supplies to the Soviets under the Lend-Lease Act. In August, Churchill and Roosevelt secretly met aboard warships in Canadian waters of the North Atlantic. There, they prepared a declaration of post-war aims known as the Atlantic Charter, which later influenced the Charter of the United Nations. We'll talk about the United Nations next unit after spring break. Both agreed to not use the war to seek new territory or to make peace with the Axis separately. They also asserted the right of all people to self-govern. 3 months later, Congress voted to allow American merchant ships to arm themselves and sail to Britain. Go ahead and pause the video, and we will pick up with this next section. Time-wise, I need to start up a new video. So go ahead and stop this video, do your one-sentence summary for the appropriate section title, the U.S. Prepares for War, and then find your your letter in the student handout posted on Google Classroom.